Hi, everyone. I always like to talk about what's going on the other side of the windows, and I'm recording this on Friday, April 3rd, about 11:45 in the morning here in Ohio. And I will say, outside my window today, it is absolutely beautiful. Blue skies, and the temperature should get up in the upper 50s. But even though on the other side of the windows, at least where I am, things are looking pretty good, before we get into today's topic, efficiency wages and setting pay, I just want to talk a little bit about a report that was released earlier today. We had talked about the unemployment rate, the survey that's done, the current population survey, the one we've been using for the SHAD assignments. And what you can notice is that when the Great Recession hit in 2008, unemployment really rose. Unemployment tends to trail GDP by a few months. Firms always want to see, hey, is this really going to be, a situation where I have to let workers go? They don't want to lose those training costs and all the firm-specific training they put in the workers. So you can see, even though the gray area is the recession, even after the economy recovered, unemployment still went up a bit and gradually came down. Well, the report that came out just this morning said that in February, unemployment had been about 3.5%, and it jumped to 4.4% when the report came out this morning. Sad to say, when this is based earlier in the month of March, that when the people that were laid off in the last 2 weeks, when those hit the unemployment rolls, this rate is really going to go up. A couple of facts to consider is not everybody who loses their job qualifies for unemployment insurance. You had to have worked, been employed, so gig workers don't count, people like an Uber driver. And also people that just enter the labor force, they don't draw unemployment insurance. So the result is, even though, believe it or not, in the last 2 weeks about 10 million Americans have filed for unemployment insurance, uh, that's really an undercount of how many people have lost their jobs. This number for April and May, when the data is released, is really going to rise substantially. So I want to talk about a concept called efficiency wages today. And it's an idea that some of my students have used in their own firms that they've wound up starting. And the idea of efficiency wages is that increasing the wages you pay your workers will result in increased productivity and profits. So generally what we assume is firms try and minimize costs. But what if it turns out, instead of the normal relationship where the wage depends on the marginal revenue product, in other words, where you pay the workers based on what they produce, so they produce a certain amount, that determines what you pay them. Efficiency wages turns that idea on its head. Maybe what you pay them will influence what they're able to produce. So the idea here is that if you pay your workers more money, they'll be more productive and you'll make more profits. So why might this be so? There's an idea called shirking. Shirking means basically to goof off. If you have a situation where all of the grocery stores in a town are paying $10 an hour, and at your grocery store you're paying $12 an hour, your workers are not going to goof off. Why? If they do, they lose the best job in town. So you get more productivity if you're paying a higher wage, because the worker says, hey, I don't want to lose this really good job. Sociologists and anthropologists talk about the idea of gift giving. So in other words, if I give you a gift, you're going to say, hey, that's really neat. I want to give you a gift as well. So if the employer gives a gift and says, hey, I'm paying you $2 more than anybody else, the worker will say, that's really neat. I don't want to lose, I want to return that gift. And the way I can return it, I'm going to really bust tail and work hard for my boss. One of the things that will happen, once again related to shirking, is that it reduces turnover. People don't want to lose the best job in town. And we've talked before about the idea that turnover can really influence the cost of labor. So here's a way to bring down turnover. And frankly, if you want to get the best workers, how can you do that? Pay more than anybody else. Think about that. If you're a senior and you're deciding between two job offers, if you're really, really, really good, you might take the one that pays more money. How do you get the best and most productive workers? Pay more money. So does this really hold water in the real world? And the answer is yes. The book talks about it a little bit, and Henry Ford started the assembly line. He started that in my hometown, Detroit, Michigan, but he discovered in 1913 turnover was terrible. His turnover was about 370% a year. What that means is he had to hire almost 4 workers every year just to have one there that was working at any given time because workers were leaving. Daily absentees rates were about 10%. 1 out of every 10 workers just didn't show up. So when you look at this, Ford said, this is really not such a good situation. What he decided to do was he raised the wage rate from $2.40 a day, yes, a day, in 1914, up to $5. And wow, this was big money. He doubled wages. He said it's only going to be you're going to get paid $5 a day instead of $2.40, and you only have to work 8 hours a day instead of 9. So the result was his turnover went from 370%, wow, down to 16%. It really saved on hiring. Absenteeism, fell from 10% down to 2.5%, and productivity per worker, since they were there, they were learning how to work together as a team. Productivity jumped tremendously to, by about 50%. More recently, there are 2 very similar firms, Costco and Sam's Club. They're both big box warehouses you have to join, and you can go and shop and buy, more croissants than you could possibly want at one time, but they're very inexpensive. Costco pays about 40% more than Sam's Club. A few years ago, I was looking into this. Costco was paying workers about $17 an hour, Sam's Club about $12 an hour. So, what's the result? Costco had turnover about 1/3 that of Walmart. Workers tended to stay at Costco. Workers tended to leave at Sam's Club. Workers were more productive. Costco found out they could get by with about half the workers per square foot of store that Walmart did. So, this was an example of that as well. If you have a restaurant like McDonald's, some of the restaurants are owned by the McDonald's company, and some are franchised. They allow somebody, to use the McDonald's name. Generally, the franchised ones, somebody has all their assets on the line. So, for example, the McDonald's in Delaware County might be owned by one individual. That person's going to be really, working hard to make sure that his employees are busting tail to be productive. The company, however, is much larger. So since they're not going to be there to supervise, what we find out is that company-owned franchises, in order to get better workers that they don't have to monitor as closely, actually pay their employees about 9% more than the franchised McDonald's. So this idea of the efficiency wages really does exist. One of my students started a painting company one summer. He paid $2 more an hour than anybody else. He got the best workers, and the result was he was able to complete his jobs more quickly and get more work. Now, one of the things I want to talk about for a firm is how can you set the pay for workers? How do we do this in the real world? And you can set the pay based on an individual or on a group. And you can have a mixture of both of these, but either you pay the individual based on what they do or what a group does, and you can pay them based on an input, what they wind up doing, or you can pay them based on an output, what they produce. So this is just a kind of a way of looking at things. Let's look at some examples. Suppose we look at a situation where you pay an individual based on their input. This would be an example of a stocker at a store. I went shopping at Kroger's the other day, and people were putting stuff on the shelves. What is the marginal revenue product of a worker that's putting paper towels on a shelf at Kroger's? Who knows? Kroger's doesn't know exactly. So since they don't know exactly what the marginal revenue of the worker is, they'll say, okay, what we'll do is we'll pay them an hourly wage. Or, for example, if General Motors has an accountant that keeps track of all the bills in their engine division, what exactly is that worker's marginal revenue product? They don't know. So that what they'll say is, okay, we'll pay you a salary based on some kind of input like hours worked. We can also have a situation where you can pay an individual based on their output. Farm workers. You might tell a farm worker, okay, for every 100 pounds of cucumbers that you pick, we'll pay you $10. Another example of this would be like a real estate agent. You could say to the real estate agent, look, we're going to pay you on commission. Every house you sell, you get 1.5% of the sales. So you're paid exactly on what you contribute. Another thing that you can use is SafeLight discovered they used to pay their, these are the folks that install windshields, they used to pay their workers an hourly rate. They switched and said, okay, we're going to pay you based on the number of windshields that you install. So it's easy to see what their output was and pay them. And by the way, when they switched, output went up by about 20%, or productivity went up by about 20%. Now, this is not as common to pay a group based on some kind of input, but it is possible to do that. Continental Airlines, which later merged with United, had a plan where they said, look, our on-time record was not very good. So they told workers, look, if you can improve our on-time record by a certain percent, what we're going to wind up doing is we'll give everybody a $100 bonus. So if the on-time record of the planes getting out of LA, it was actually out of LAX airport, if it hits 90%, then everybody gets a $100 bonus. So the gate agents, the people that are cleaning, the people, the crew loading and unloading the planes, everybody has an incentive. It's not based on the marginal revenue product, but it's based on an idea, okay, what's the input? How much did you contribute? And finally, sometimes you can pay a group based on their output, what they can produce. You can think of an example where if people are really satisfied with the service at Starbucks, there's a tip jar, and it goes to the group. The group divides it up at the end of the shift. It's based on how well they serve the customers. I think I've mentioned at the class, I've done some research looking at immigrant workers in rural Ohio. And there's places in Ohio that raise a lot of chickens. They're raised in an enclosed building. And what they'll do is they will hire a crew of workers, and they'll say, okay, we will pay you based on the number of chickens that the crew catches. So one person will be chasing the chickens, one person will be grabbing the chickens, one person will be putting them, will be driving the tractor that's hauling the chickens away. So based on the number of chickens that are put in cages and hauled away, I'm sorry if you're a vegetarian, you pay the group based on that. I hope you've learned a little something today that you can use in your own careers, in your own jobs, thinking about how wages can be set. Email me with any questions. I'll be glad to Skype, Google Hangouts. If you think it'll be helpful, we can set up a group, Google Hangout or something like that. But most importantly, everybody, stay well.